The Keynote heißt Democratizing the Digital Economy Beyond the False Utopias of Big Tech and Towards Genuine Empowerment begrüßen wir Evgeny Morozov.
Thank you for this introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with so many people who are clearly very enthusiastic about finding ways in which we can go beyond centralized and hierarchical solutions coming out of either Beijing or Silicon Valley. I must confess that a decade ago, I found myself in a digital paradise of sorts where PowerPoints do not exist, and I've been living in it ever since. Quite happily. So I have to work twice as hard as all the other speakers because there is no visual candy to entertain you. So I hope I will not disappoint. This week is probably the best week so far to talk about democratizing digital economy. You might have seen that yesterday Facebook announced record-breaking results over this last quarter. So they have made more money than ever before. They've made $6.8 billion, that's profits, not revenue, which brought their total for the year, their total profit for the year of 2018 to more than $20 billion, right? And that's a year when Facebook was bombarded with scandals, where it was in the news almost every day, and where it was compared to the worst possible atrocity committing institutions far beyond the corporate world, right? Even this week, it was in the news again, and I think the scandal of this week could nicely illustrate some of the broader problems that we are all facing. So if you haven't followed the most recent scandal, which I would like actually to use at the beginning to illustrate some of the bigger themes to which I will come back, let me just walk you through the facts a little bit. So this week, Apple actually suspended all of Facebook's internal apps, right? The apps that they're actually using inside the company to, organize transportation, organize meals internally through, iOS. They just suspended them yesterday, essentially paralyzing much of activity inside Facebook. Right? Which, of course, wasn't necessarily the best news to hear on the day when they recorded, where they posted record-breaking profits. And that came about because of extremely rogue behavior on behalf of Facebook, which I think is typical of the problems that we're all confronting. So what happened? Basically, a couple of years ago, Facebook acquired an Israeli startup which was just offering a VPN service. Or it was claiming to be offering a virtual private network service, right? So you could actually connect to whatever sites you wanted to, and the promise was that all your information will be stored freely, it will not, and privately. It will not be made available to the websites that you visit. So the whole premise of that VPN was more or less what VPNs promised to deliver. Of course, few have noticed that the actual goal of that VPN was for Facebook to collect all that data itself and then to use it in order to optimize their own internal planning. They actually wanted to see what websites people were visiting while using that VPN, right? Which I think brings us to myth number one of these three big myths and problems I would like to discuss today, and it has to do with the way in which the reality of what many of these big centralized American but also Chinese firms do is often the very opposite, right, of what they promise. So while they promise that we will actually have full security and privacy, in reality, it's the opposite of it. They are the ones who are actually peering into our supposedly private communications to then understand what products and services to launch to satisfy the needs that might exist among customers using that VPN. So having discovered that, Apple actually banned that VPN, that app, last August. Facebook, however, continued using it through a loophole, which it found, and it basically allowed people to install or reinstall a similar app through its internal channel with Apple, right? So you could actually install it bypassing the App Store, which is what they did, and they started paying people aged 13 to 25, most of them teenagers, $20 a month to essentially spy on everything that was happening on their devices where this app was installed. So for $20 a month, Facebook would actually look inside your device, look at your browsing history, look at every single website you visited, and would then do something with that data, right? And that, I think, brings us to the second myth, or the second problem, and it has to do with the fact that there are certain imperatives, many of them related to growth and competition inside these firms, that constantly push them to engage in such rogue behavior, right? So they constantly need to have more data. They constantly need to find more and more ways to actually find ways to extract it. And they are not even prevented by any codes of ethics or legal norms or social norms. All of that they push aside, and instead in its place, they enact all sorts of rhetorical gestures, ideological gestures, which present all of that as just being part of living in a frictionless society where everything is getting easier and more efficient. Right, so as that was happening, and as Facebook kept paying $20 a month to all the people it was spying upon, which to some extent was actually a transaction, so people knew what they were getting themselves into, Apple discovered that as well this week and eventually disabled Facebook's entire access to that internal kind of program that they had between the two of them. So all of Facebook's other apps essentially that were developed with iOS collapsed, right? Which brings me to the third problem, or the third myth, which has to do with the immense power that in this case Apple has to decide or to determine which of us are allowed to leave, so to say, and continue our activities on their platform, and which ones should actually be cut or should be relegated to a secondary role, right? And I think all three of these problems, on the one hand, this immense rhetorical power, which allows to claim that the services and companies offer us one thing, while they actually offer us the exact opposite of it. The fact that there are these huge imperatives which push them to engage in behavior that is not just aggressive, but very often unethical, outright illegal. And on the third, this consolidation of immense social and political power in the hands of these platforms, which is not at all regulated by any normal, formal legal frameworks, right? It's essentially all up to the hierarchy of that corporation to decide who is supposed to prosper and who is supposed to die, right? And I think these three problems nicely illustrate the broader set of tactics and concerns that the digital economy as it currently exists presents us with. And I would like to give you a little bit more examples on each of the three, right? Because I think it's important and essential that we manage to break through some of this immense mystification that has been erected and that has emerged in the last, 20 or 25 years, and actually start thinking more critically. Because I think that what you heard this morning from Peter about this choice, right, between, on the one hand, a more democratic system, a more decentralized system, where we might all be flourishing, and a system that does remind us of the Middle Ages, that choice is not, it's not some kind of an imaginary choice, right? It's something that actually is a choice facing society right now, right? And when I talk about the aggregation of immense power in private hands, right, mostly of Americans or Chinese firms, you do have to remember that such aggregation and exercise of power by private actors in an arbitrary manner was in fact the core distinguishing feature of feudalism, right? That's what feudalism was. It was an exercise of power in an arbitrary way outside of any possible legal or political framework that let the subjects, the citizens in this case, have a voice in what happens to them. Right? And while I don't want to argue, of course, that we are somehow stumbling back into a feudal society because all the signs, at least visible ones, are against it, the transformation in this power relationship between, on the one hand, these intermediaries that mediate more and more of our economic activity and our social life, whether it has to do with education or health, or transportation, it's undeniable that this new set of intermediaries exist and that they operate based on imperatives that are quite logical, but that have not actually been synchronized with those of their subjects, which is basically us, right? And I think this is where the only possible answer to the power of big tech is that big tech is good, but in small doses, right? Big tech in big doses leads to a lot of social turmoil. And I think that this is what we are living through today. And I will come back to all of this and even hopefully give you some grounds for optimism. Let me just go back to maybe explaining and walking you through all of these three problems step by step, and also maybe giving you a few more examples to illustrate how each of them works. So if you think about this initial myth-making, right, and the mismatch between the reality on the one hand and the promise, I think we have to understand that every time we are asked to evaluate the bargain, right, this digital bargain that we have struck with the digital giants, right? On the one hand, of course, we usually look mostly at the immediate positive side. Everything is getting cheaper. Everything is getting more efficient. A lot of things are becoming free. There is almost no friction involved in how society operates anymore, and lack of friction, we are told, is good. Right? So the positive side of the balance sheet, I think, is known to all of us, in part because it also forms core part of the talking points that that industry itself constantly reinforces in society, right? With media, conferences, and so forth. But the reality, if you look at it, is very different, right? Because you can actually, if you understand their business models, and if you understand the way in which those business models are funded, and what the expectations behind those business models are, will quickly disabuse you of the myth and of the idea that the low prices or the absence of prices, which means that everything is free, you'll quickly understand that this is just a temporary outcome which is likely to change in the near future. That these services will not remain so cheap and free forever, but that they're actually right now, in most cases, heavily subsidized by players like venture capitalists, or by the fact that these services are not actually meant to be profitable, because all they do is harvesting data, which then is monetized through very different services that are also sold by these firms. Now, one of my favorite quotes is that of Andrew Ng, who used to be a very big head of AI at Google and then later at Baidu, who's now a very prominent also investor in AI projects. And speaking at Stanford last year, I think he kind of let the cat out of the bag. He opened the secret on what makes a lot of these big tech firms kind of go and expand the way they expand. And he said that basically, in most of these companies, we launch products not because we expect to monetize them, but we launch products because we expect to harvest data, which we then monetize through other products, right? But of course, if our entire framework of analysis of this industry is biased towards what happens to the user and what happens to the consumer, we tend to lose sight of the fact that there is actually somebody paying a higher price for that user and consumer to be paying a lower price. Or that there is perhaps a venture capitalist, or, as now is the case very often, some government, like the government of Saudi Arabia, which invests dozens of billions of dollars into big tech, which is actually subsidizing the provision of services like those of Uber, so that Uber can actually go crush the competition, become the sole provider of many transportation services, and once they have become the sole provider of transportation services, then either raise the prices or switch to a completely automated model where there will be no drivers, and then you can eliminate labor costs. Right? It's a very simple calculus, but it's also a very risky game, because you essentially, being one of those firms, you need to stay in the game long enough and sustain losses long enough to convince customers on the one hand that your model is very good and superior and generates quite a lot of savings, right? And at the same time, you have to be able to get the competition out of the way, right? And then that generates all sorts of secondary dynamics, which are quite ugly. You know, so if you look at Uber, Uber has lost more than $4.5 billion in the United States last year, okay? In 2017, sorry. The numbers for 2018 are not yet in, but it will be a figure of the same range. So it's a company that essentially is losing $4.5 billion for several years in a row, right? That's quite a lot of money to lose, which also explains why it's able to offer its customers services that are so cheap, right? Because you actually have very deep pockets, and you can stay in that game longer than your competitors. What else does Uber do? So Uber, for example, ran something very similar to what I have just described to you with Facebook. So they ran essentially a spying program called Grey Ball, where they were monitoring any users who might be asking for Uber cars near government buildings, right? And they were also monitoring their credit card details to see if those credit card details might indicate that these people belong to some police union department, or that they might actually be affiliated with authorities. So in this case, you see that there is an extensive surveillance of users, not because Uber wants to convert those consumers and users into permanent customers. They want to survey them because it actually wants to avoid having them as customers, because it doesn't want to get regulated, right? So Uber essentially has built a spying system that has allowed itself to make its cars invisible to any customers who it's suspected of working for law enforcement, right? Or any organizations related to state and authorities that would actually be exercising some control over how it operates. You see that in this case, there is clearly a lot of extraction of data, there is a lot of surveillance, there is a lot of nefarious behavior going on, with the sole goal. That goal is reducing costs in the long run, because that's the precondition to Uber essentially getting to its IPO, raising its money that it needs to essentially stay in the business for another 2 or 3 years, so that it can continue losing $3 or $4 billion again. Right? Again, all I'm saying here is not to somehow say that being in debt is bad or that losing money is bad. All of that is a normal process of operation in capitalism. Right? All I'm saying is that there is something built into this industry, and that something is basically the expectation that you can build a platform, right, and then scale it everywhere, and you can become the default provider of services in a lot of verticals with not so much money invested at the outset, but if you do succeed, you will actually be the world's leader in that industry. You'll create a monopoly, which is what Uber wants to do, but you can also look at many other firms in that sector, and then you'll be able to essentially milk that market forever, right? Whatever the ultimate benefits of that model might be, right? And we will, of course, have a lot of debates about whether it's very good for those working for these companies, whether it's very good for those who are using them. That's a debate to be had. But regardless of that, getting to that point requires so much violence and so much norm transgression and so much unethical behavior that I'm not even sure that that model is worth it. Right? So the fact that, as of now, many of those services are cheap, or many of the services are free, or one of those companies is coming to you and offering you a heavily subsidized, I don't know, Wi-Fi system because they will be collecting the data, it means absolutely nothing, because you will eventually come to regret those cost savings, or somebody else in society will come to regret them. Because that free lunch, which this digital economy promises to us, it simply does not exist. These costs are either externalized on somebody else, or they're hidden, or that they are essentially prolonged into the future, and they will be recouped once the prices are raised back to the level where they were. Right? And I think this should awaken us to the proper description of the system. You know, very often is described as surveillance capitalism, right? Or platform capitalism, or data capitalism. You know, in the case of examples like Facebook that I have given you, or Uber, I think the proper name for it is actually rogue capitalism, I mean, this is what it is. It's not about surveillance per se. It's not about data. It's about engaging in rather, let's say, transgressive behaviors, which, if we thought about them rationally, we would never actually sanction as a society, but which we tacitly accept because most of us as consumers have to deal only with the most visible part of this rogue project, and that visible part are the low prices or completely lack of prices that we face, right? And I think we need to go beyond that if we do not want to find ourselves in a trap similar to the one that emerged now because of the way in which we treated, for example, energy consumption for a very long time. And I know it's a very controversial debate still going on in Germany, but nonetheless, you know, we could have been celebrating all we wanted, the cheap energy of 1970s or 1980s, but the bill for it eventually arrives, right? And it arrives in the form of economy, in terms of higher prices, energy transition, and so forth. But that bill does arrive sooner or later. I mean, here we are dealing with stuff that I would argue is even more fundamental than energy. You know, we are dealing with information and data, which is the lifeblood of democracy. It's the lifeblood of the public sphere, right? It's the lifeblood how we organize and deliberate problems that we have and that we face collectively. If that system itself now becomes the hostage of this extremely aggressive rogue business models, the bill for it will eventually arrive. And that bill will be rather nasty, you know, and to some extent, what we're now seeing with Brexit and Donald Trump and the spread of fake news and misinformation are the early signs of what the final bill for rebuilding society based on this infrastructure, which is extremely insecure, which is open to manipulation, which is basically exists solely to extract more and more data from you by increasing user engagement, which of course is just a euphemism for creating addiction to the services. And that's what this infrastructure is. And I think the sooner we realize that, and the sooner we start asking critical questions associated with this idea that these companies have to grow at all costs, and that those costs can in fact be externalized on society, and on some of us, the sooner we start raising those questions, the better. Because only that way can we actually start also dealing with the immense political and social power, which was the third element that I've highlighted in the Facebook example, that these firms and platforms have accumulated. You know, the idea that it should be up to them to decide which of us are allowed to engage in political speech and which of us aren't. The idea that it's also up to them, having set up this massive system, to decide what counts as fake news and what doesn't. The idea that it should be up to them to essentially deploy all the AI that they have built partly with our data, to then also become the ultimate decision makers and gatekeepers on a lot of processes that shape our democratic system, I think in itself, it's a very big bet that we will come to regret. Right? And I think the goal here is not to simply, you know, bash business or, you know, bash corporations. You know, I'm in the wrong audience and the wrong conference to do that. And in fact, that's not what I'm trying to do. I do think, however, that there is a way in which this system can be re-engineered, right? And it should be re-engineered not in a way that will make those business models even more sustainable. So now if you go and listen to some of the debates in Washington, but also in Brussels, there is, for example, this idea that the times of advertising are gone. So now we need to switch Facebook from an advertising model to a subscriptions-based model. We need to switch YouTube, again, from an advertising-based model to a subscriptions-based model, which YouTube, by the way, already actually does have. Right? And to me, this is simply not enough, because it will only convert the problems that are real and that already exist with regards to how these companies maximize engagement and essentially create addiction into a permanent revenue stream for them. So now they wouldn't even have to worry about making money, because we'll all be paying 10 or 15 or 20 euros per month to be using their services without any guarantee that they will still not have incentives to extract our data to optimize their own algorithmic curatorial services on the platform. I don't know how many of you use Netflix, but Netflix is a subscription-based system, and it's as interested as Facebook in getting you usage services and never leave the site. And they do extract a lot of information from what it is that you watch in order to actually get you hooked later on and to help them curate their own collection. So the idea that somehow subscriptions is the solution, or we can kind of come up with a somewhat better business model for the Facebooks of this world, I find it completely unrealistic. What is, I think, a better solution is to start radically asking questions as to how we can rearrange the environment in which similar businesses can work, but without having the same sort of incentives that Google and Facebook and all the other firms in this industry face. Right? And I think the only way to do it is to basically make it as hard for them as possible to be the custodians and the guardians of our data and of our identities. Right? So that is something that should be off limits. That's not something that in a democratic system we actually make up for grabs. Just like we do not make up for grabs a lot of other things in the democratic system, which is fully capitalist. You know, you do not sell organs. We do not sell space in our minds when we go to vote. Right? We impose certain limits on what is for sale and what is not, and what is subject to market relations and what isn't. And that's actually a precondition for even healthier market relations to be built on top. So if we can imagine a system where both the identity and the data parts of this infrastructure are actually not under a hierarchical, centralized corporate control, but we actually build a model where companies like Facebook and Google can exist, but if they want to access data belonging to the residents of a certain municipality in Bremen or Barcelona or Rome, they will actually have to come in, and they will probably have to pay for access to that data, and according to rates, that, given their size and location, will probably be somewhat higher than the rates that would be charged to a local startup working in that neighborhood, who might even be eligible to receive some kind of a grant from some kind of a public venture fund. And all sorts of new models that are also friendly to SMEs become possible once we manage to reestablish control over this crucial part of infrastructure, which has now been completely kind of sucked out from the system by these firms, and who are basically building their own next models based on it. Whether it has to do with artificial intelligence or self-driving cars or diagnosing cancer, all of that in one way or another is intershaped and underwritten and underpinned by this basic data-intensive and identity-intensive infrastructure that they have privatized, so to say, without asking anyone for permission. Right? And society and the political layers, of course, of our society have not been far-sighted enough to understand the importance of those layers. Right? And I think this is what brings us to a situation where we have very little to do inside the current system if you do not find a way to radically democratize access to the most useful stuff inside it, which at this point I would say is data, and to some extent the ability to link that data to actual individuals producing it. Right? So this brings us, I think, to articulating an agenda that will not just be negative, because this is also a very standard policy response. If you again go to Brussels, even if you go to Berlin, if you go to Washington, the most radical approach to some of the problems I have identified is to do to big tech what once we did to big oil, so to say, right? So we just have to treat Google and Facebook the way 100 years ago we used to treat Rockefeller's Standard Oil, and we just need to break it up. So instead of having Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook under one roof, we'll just have 3 of them making the services addictive to you on their own. So you'll have 3 separate addictions instead of one addiction centralized under the roof of Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. And I think to some extent there is a certain promise behind that program, and it's the promise that once you make these companies compete, they will essentially perhaps not engage in this unethical rogue behavior. No, and I wish that was true, and maybe that would be true. But I think that this purely negative project of breaking up the big tech, it does not inspire much confidence. And it's too negative to articulate any positive vision of how the future should actually look like. And I think here we definitely need a constructive agenda as well, right? And that constructive agenda has to be able to articulate what sort of new political and social institutions with regards to data and with regards to particular arrangements around data and identities we need to put in place to enable a very different economic model, right? Where, I don't care how the next successor to Google or Facebook will monetize their services, whether it will be through subscriptions, whether it will be by organizing some kind of a charity system with, governments paying for access to those services, whether it will be even through advertising, I think should be relevant. All those approaches should be tried, and the best one should win. But we have to be absolutely sure that these companies have no underlying agenda and have no hidden mechanisms to affect how data is collected, aggregated, and manipulated, right? And that's the problem that I think we need to be able to solve. And once we solve it, then we can actually open up access to that data and have these companies do whatever they want within a certain set of rules. With regards to transparency of the algorithms, with regards to what in GDPR you will actually see is often discussed, if not mentioned explicitly, as the right to explanation. Right? We want our citizens capable of being able to actually turn to the providers of the digital services and ask for an explanation why a certain classification decision was made, why it was that you were told that, to use the most extreme Chinese example, you were not allowed to board that plane, as is the case with the social credit system. And by the way, as totalitarian that system is, they actually do give you that right. You can actually inquire into why exactly a certain decision happened, even though I wouldn't count on it being the most accurate response you would get in return. So wrapping up, I think the challenges that are facing us are many, but it's also very important, I think, to realize that we are not just dealing with some kind of transgressions and a bunch of bad apples who, if only we were to replace Mark Zuckerberg with some kind of a nicer, more humane hacker, then things will suddenly in Facebook would go differently. I think that there is a very rational process that very often shapes what these firms do, and that process has itself to do with the extremely loose nature of the legal framework in which these firms operate. So if these firms start on the assumption that there is no limit as to how much data they can extract, how much of our attention they can hijack, and how much of addiction they can generate, of course they will come up with the most rational responses to extract as much of it and to make us as addicted as possible. That's just natural behavior dictated by competition. It's not some kind of a sign of extreme evilness on their part. Right? And unfortunately, until we realize that, we will not move very far. And the problem is that up until very recently, and that's the only, from my end anyway, positive consequence of Donald Trump's election, is that suddenly the influence of this industry and of Silicon Valley, but specifically of Facebook and its relationship to Cambridge Analytica and the way in which manipulating these networks can actually yield political outcomes that are not at all desirable, suddenly those problems because of that have come into view. And we started having a discussion which we should have been having 20 years ago. Right? So I think it's a positive sign that we're having that discussion. But I think, again, it's very important not to get trapped into nice and clean solutions that would just promise us salvation by a tweak in how these firms operate, switching to subscriptions from advertising. We need a holistic system, and that holistic system has to look at where the value is. And the value right now is, to some extent, mostly in the data layer. And unless we resolve that problem, I think not much will come from efforts to actually tame the big tech. Thank you very much, and I think I'm right on time. Good, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Evgeny Morozov.